You are watching the 62nd edition of Worldview from Islamabad, coming to you from the headquarters of PTV Network, right here in the Pakistani capital. Now, talking about the Pakistani-American relationship is really never out of fashion. It's a vibrant relationship and it keeps reinventing itself. And on this show, of course, we've dedicated many editions to talking about this relationship. And today, I'm glad to have with me here in the studio the Ambassador of the United States of America to Pakistan, Ambassador Ryan C. Crocker. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Mr. Quraishi. It's good to be back.
Now, first of all, Mr. Ambassador, I should take a moment out to say this. You have, by being here, have in a way ignored the stringent security procedures that normally American officials follow while being here in Islamabad. And you're coming here, you're sitting here for the first time, and I'd like to thank you for doing that.
Well, as I said, it's a pleasure to be back on the show, in spite of those stringent security procedures, I've been able to get around Pakistan a fair bit during my time here.
Which is impressive because in a way also, and since we are of course approaching the time that very soon you'll be leaving the country to take up your new post in Baghdad in Iraq, it shows how much you value the relationship that you've built here with the Pakistanis, and I must thank you for that.
Well, it's been a pleasure. When I was asked by my superiors to go to Iraq, they started the conversation by saying that my long vacation in Pakistan was coming to an end.
Oh, interesting.
And in many respects, I feel the same way myself. It's been a lot of hard work, but I've enjoyed every minute of it.
That's great. Now, as I was, just before this interview, I was doing my research, and as part of that research, I got in touch with a lot of people here in Islamabad, people, diplomats, people in the government, political activists, and people in the media, people who would have met you or have seen you working very closely. And I was just trying to suss out, what the feelings are, about you and how, they've seen you work here. And I was surprised. I mean, there was an overwhelming, confluence of opinions coming to one point, really. I mean, most of them were saying you were an outstanding ambassador here, that during your tenure you've really built bridges here, and they say you've been very exceptional in the way you've been also sensitive to Pakistani feelings here. I talked to different people, and people related to me different occasions in which you've been very sensitive, very understanding, but of course at the same time you were doing your job, you were doing it firmly and perfectly naturally, and especially a lot of people, as I was talking to them, came up with this event right after the earthquake. October 2000 last year, and it was many of them said that you played an outstanding role in galvanizing the Pakistani-American relationship to come to serve the people who fell victim in that earthquake. So, on behalf of many people who asked me to convey, their gratitude and their thanks to you for the role you played in building the bridges between Islamabad and Washington.
Well, thank you. They're very kind. The earthquake is something none of us who are here will ever forget. The stunning, unbelievable news that 75,000 Pakistanis had perished in 2 minutes is still something that a year and a half later is almost impossible to comprehend. It was our duty to step forward, and I'm just glad we were able to help. And I thank all those anonymous people out there who spoke kindly of me. I'm a little bit concerned that you were surprised by it.
Well, it's just, on TV you have to be a little dramatic, so it's okay. Now, I'll go straight to the questions, Ambassador. Now, of course, there are a lot of points in our relationship, the Pakistani-American relationship. Now, one of the high points recently was the visit of Vice President Dick Cheney. He was here. Now, while he was here, when he left, of course, there were many reports talking about a tough message that was delivered and so forth. And of course, later on, some American spokespersons, the White House, they played down those reports and also some Pakistani spokespeople as well. Now, you were with the Vice President while he was here. What's the real story?
Well, the real story is just what you heard from people speaking officially, including a senior official on the Vice President's plane who said he was surprised by these reports of a tough message from the Vice President, because that isn't the Vice President's style. It's also not the style and tenor of this bilateral relationship. We face a lot of hard, complicated issues. We face them together. The Vice President came here to consult on what the best way forward is for us, for Pakistan, for Afghanistan in this difficult border region. But that's what it was. It was a process of evaluation, of consultation. How do we go forward from here?
Now, Ambassador, after the 1980s and the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion and whatever came after that, now, these days, we are witnessing, of course, very close Pakistani-American cooperation. And, of course, a lot of people, this is an academic question, really. A lot of people talk about the kind of bridges we've built, both nations back in the 1980s, both governments, people in government working with each other. And now we get another chance to really work closely. How would you describe, being part, of course, of all of this Pakistani-American dialogue and cooperation, how would you describe the kind of understanding? Do we understand each other? Do the American officials coming here understand the Pakistanis? And do the Pakistani officials understand the Americans? Do we have that closeness?
I think this is a very important question. I certainly came to Pakistan in the fall of 2004, informed certainly by the policy that President Bush and his administration had set toward Pakistan, but also informed by our history of how we had a very close relationship in the 80s and then became estranged in the 90s. And we had to rebuild it all over again after 9/11. So I think we need to be informed by our history, the good parts and the not so good parts, as we build for the future. Because what we're doing now, I think, is something different than what we did in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the relationship was effectively about a single issue, which was getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan. What we're doing now is something much broader and deeper and far more enduring. We're allies in the war on terror, certainly, but that is by no means the totality of the relationship. Both our governments have worked very, very hard over these last several years to build a multifaceted relationship that concentrates on economic and social development in Pakistan, that concentrates on educational exchanges, that focuses on Pakistan's constructive regional and international role. So I won't give you the whole long list because it is a long list.
We might touch on those points during the conversation. But what you're saying that we have that kind of understanding, we do understand each other, is that what you're saying?
Certainly, government to government, we've developed a very keen and thorough understanding, I think, of each other's concerns, positions, priorities. We have to keep working on broadening that to a people-to-people understanding, and some of these programs that we'll probably talk about later get into that, because for the long term, it's important not only that our governments understand each other, but it's important that our peoples understand each other.
Now, talking about understanding, when you came here, when you took up the post here in Islamabad, I read some reports in the media, basically, that within the State Department, Islamabad was one of those, no-go areas, one of those tough missions that many diplomats, would, try to avoid. Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain was a superb ambassador here, but unfortunately she had to go because she had these personal reasons. But part of those personal reasons had to do with the fact that because of the war on terror being waged near and in and around our region, it was one of the factors that made her consider departing. You came here, you took a post, it's a tough position. And so my question is when officials take a position here, diplomats and things like that, that's where you need to have clarity, where you need to have things very clear, and that whatever perceptions or misperceptions that exist in the media need to be avoided, and we need to be closer. I guess my question would be here is that I hope that the picture about Islamabad is clearer now within the American diplomatic community.
Well, I've certainly done everything I could during my time here to try to paint the reality of Islamabad, of the government's aspirations and orientations, of the challenges that Pakistan faces, and what the way forward is. I've also tried, to the best of my ability, to convey here, both to the government and to the Pakistani people, how things look from our side of the ocean. Because again, I think Americans need to understand maybe a little bit better than they do as they look at issues like the border region between Pakistan and Afghanistan, the long history of that area, how complex and difficult the issues are, how much Pakistan has done in the war on terror. I don't think any country has done more. And the price that Pakistan has paid in the lives of its soldiers and law enforcement officials. I think Americans need to understand that a little bit better. A major effort by Pakistan against a very difficult problem. I think, too, though, it's important for Pakistanis to understand the long-term impact of 9/11 on Americans, the most devastating attack in our history as a country. And there is a fear on the part of Americans that could be repeated, that our common enemy, working from the border regions, still there, still active, still planning, would still like to strike into the heart of the United States. And again, I think it's important that people here understand that is very deeply felt in the U.S.
Now, of course, do you think, on the first part, do you think we are making a good job here of explaining to the Americans what the situation is here?
I think that is the case.
Not just the official. I mean, I'm talking about the media as well.
I think this is such a complex issue that you can't do a single story and say, that's it, we've explained it. There has to be a certain iterative process in this, and because it is complicated, it maybe has to be done by stages. I think one important explanation is one provided by the government in looking at the tribal areas and how to deal with them. Of course, the government is now producing a sustainable development plan, multi-year, for the tribal areas. That gives an indication that this is a set of issues that have to be dealt with a complex strategy. Now, we have tried to indicate very concretely that we understand that, and that's why we announced last week that to support the government's efforts to develop the tribal areas, we are making a commitment of $750 million over a 5-year period, $150 million a year beginning this year, 2007. So the government's explanation of a complex strategy to deal with complex issues, I think, then helped us in turn identify and commit the resources that will support that plan.
In committing the resources, Mr. Ambassador, and in supporting that plan, of course, you're matching words with actions. What do you say then about the, what seems to be, contradictory statements and messages? I don't know if there are messages. I mean, things like, statements coming from some of the U.S. commanders on the ground in Afghanistan, and also from Washington, D.C. I mean, over the past few weeks, we've dealt with that. Statements. Mr. Negroponte's statement, for example, is one example that many analysts would quote in this regard. So it seems like contradictory messages and contradictory statements. This is a concern that I'm sure you must have felt, here in Islamabad. What do you say to that?
Well, first, we have to be careful. There is a great deal that is said here and in the U.S. One has to look at the sourcing. We talked about this just a moment ago. The attribution given to the Vice President's visit to Pakistan, that he was coming to deliver a tough message. That was the way it was presented in the media. That was not reality. And official spokesman later clarified that. So first we've got to differentiate between what is said by officials and what is speculated on by non-officials. As we look at statements by officials, we have to look at them in context. There are a lot of hearings going on now on the Hill. These are normally lengthy affairs. What you often get is sort of a one-sentence headline out of a very complex answer. Sure. So you've got to look at the whole thing. And when you do, I think you'll see that what is being said by U.S. officials is not so very different than what has been said by Pakistani officials, including President Musharraf himself, in talking about the tribal areas and being very frank about the presence both of Taliban elements and Arab al-Qaeda supporters.
Now, since we're talking about, of course, understanding each other and being careful in reading these statements and all, there's this another thing, reports that the U.S. House of Representatives just passed a legislation. The U.S. Senate has also passed a legislation, and the first one, of course, seemed to be linking or recommending that future aid to Pakistan by the U.S. government be linked to certain conditions. And the second one appears to be, there are various analyses about that. We were not sure, but the point is here. I guess my question here would be: the ordinary people, the public opinion, don't have the luxury of time, maybe, or of resources to really analyze what's going on. What they do is this: it's coming from America, from Washington, D.C., and the both houses, or one of the houses, just passed legislation. They want to restrict aid, and it reminds people, takes them back to the Presler Amendment days and so forth, So, the people here, and of course you must have heard many Pakistanis and read talking about blackmail and good cop and bad cop and so forth. Pressure tactics. How do you respond to this?
Well, I've heard it all, and I do understand the sensitivities. As we agreed at the beginning, this is a relationship that has a history. The 90s was not a good time for the relationship, and what we have to do is commit ourselves to learn from that and not to repeat it, and I think that's just what we're doing. The House bill did have a provision calling on the administration to certify that Pakistan was making every effort as an ally in the war on terror. The administration can certify that in a heartbeat, but the administration opposes the language in the House bill because we simply do not believe that there should be any requirement for that. Pakistan is an ally. It has demonstrated that steadfastness in the blood of its soldiers, and we don't think there should be any provision requiring a certification. Now, you turn to the Senate side. Again, it's complicated. The Senate version of the House bill contains no language at all about Pakistan. Now the two versions go to conference, and it will be the position of the administration that the Senate version with respect to Pakistan should prevail, and that's the outcome we hope to see. There is a sense of the Senate resolution or amendment that has language on Pakistan, but it is non-binding. It does not require, it's a sense of the Senate. It is, it therefore has no force. It does not require Pakistan to do anything, which it couldn't in any case. It does not require the administration to do anything. So, while certainly aware of the sensitivities here and aware of the past, it's also important that people take a close look at exactly what is going on the Hill, and to take a look at what the administration's position is. I think we're in pretty good shape right now.
That's great. Now, State Department, there was a report released by the State Department, human rights situation all over the world, and there was, of course, this report about Pakistan. And there was a point in that report where, Pakistan was criticized for detentions that did not meet the requirements of the law. And many Pakistanis felt, and I talked to officials and others, and they felt, this is like, those detentions, many of those detentions actually are connected to the war against terrorism, and they have to do with terrorism. And many felt, I don't know, so whoever wrote that report was, trying to look good and politically correct at the expense of us. And this is the exact word I heard from somebody I spoke to, and they felt, this is a double standard.
Well, I think it's important to see it again in context. Indeed, that report isn't saying anything that one doesn't hear from Pakistanis themselves. One of the great things about Pakistan is the freedom of speech and expression, and the passion with which people here exercise it. Nobody's shy about expressing a view. And we've all certainly seen and read the criticisms and concerns that Pakistanis themselves have expressed in public on detention-related issues. And indeed, much of what is in that report is drawn from what is being said in the public debate here about detentions in Pakistan.
But if I were in government, Mr. Ambassador, I would expect you to understand my position a little better and not criticize, because if I were the government and I've gone and done and been responsible for some of these detentions, it was because of the requirements of the war on terror. I mean, the U.S. government had to take some steps, like the Guantanamo Bay, in order to
and got criticized for it.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. You had to pay a price, in those terms. Well, I guess that's one of those points that need to, it can be looked from different angles. Now, one more thing that I need to ask you here now, and that concerns, of course, we've seen, of course, in recent weeks, I don't know, a better sort of relationship now appearing to prevail now between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And of course, the U.S. has played a role in that, of course, and there were many statements to that effect. The situation right now, briefly, before I move on to other questions, the situation right now in terms of, we have these reports about, the spring offensive and so forth, and a lot of work is going on behind the scenes in order to preempt that. What's going on right now, and what are the future plans? The three countries are drawing, the allies, they're working on this point.
Well, you're right, I think, in your analysis. There is a lot of constructive contact between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It also involves, as appropriate, the U.S., other NATO allies. I think the general trend now is a positive one, and there are lots of examples. The two Jirga commissions have just met here in Islamabad. Very positive statements coming out of both commissions. There will be a return visit by the Pakistani Commission, I understand, in early April to continue the process. That's encouraging. The tripartite military cooperation continues to be excellent at a variety of levels, dealing seriously and concretely with border issues of common concern. Just this past week, we've seen a delegation of women journalists coming over from Afghanistan. There will be a return visit. So there is a lot going on in the relationship that is positive. And I think what that reflects is the fact that Pakistan and Afghanistan have essentially common goals for their countries and their peoples, and face a common adversary.
Now, in Afghanistan, Mr. Ambassador, the U.S. relied a lot in the beginning, of course, and of course, sometimes the situation on the ground dictates certain courses of action, and one of those courses of action was the heavy reliance on warlords. And of course, these warlords were beneficial in one way, of course, if you're going to analyze the situation, but on the other hand, of course, they were the root cause of certain other ills that are now beginning to spread, drug trade and crime and other things. So, I don't know. Do you feel, many people in Pakistan who are concerned about our relationship also with Afghanistan and would like to see a stable Afghanistan. You just met yesterday, I think, our interior minister, and he said, of course, we need to see a stable Afghanistan. Our entire plans for the future, for Central Asia, the Gwadar port, are based on Afghanistan. So if we're going to say stability in Afghanistan, we need to work also on those little things, and one of them is the warlords and how to really rid the Afghan society in Afghanistan of that menace as well.
Well, I was in Afghanistan shortly after the fall of the Taliban.
You opened the embassy?
I reopened the embassy there, and certainly came away with lasting impressions of the state of utter devastation that prevailed in much of the country. And it was, as you said at that time, that the writ of the central government was pretty weak. There were warlords around the country. If you look at the situation now, 5 years later, it has changed very much for the better. If you look at Herat, if you look at Mazar-e Sharif, just to name two places where warlords once held sway, they're gone. And not only are they gone, it was handled peacefully and politically. So while we still have a situation in which Afghan institutions are developing, you cannot get from where Afghanistan was immediately after 9/11 to a fully developed state, army, police, and everything else. You can't do that overnight. It takes time. But I think the progress is very good. And the progress politically, I think, is encouraging. Again, the warlords are not what they were by any means. And if there is one single achievement of the Karzai administration that I would really highlight, it's just that.
That's a good point. So, I mean, gradually, slowly and gradually, we're moving in a direction where at some point in the future we're going to see less and less, as we move on, there'll be a less and less reliance on the warlords to run Afghanistan.
I think you've already seen that.
Yeah.
What Afghanistan, Pakistan, and NATO are facing now really isn't so much the warlordism of the past as it is this Taliban surge. Now, I think we can deal with that. I think we just have to show resolve and cooperation among us, and we're demonstrating it. The Taliban isn't going to win unless we kind of give up and let them win.
Right.
But that's not the warlordism of the past period, and I again would commend Pakistan in that regard. We've all seen the reports of recent arrests of a number of Taliban figures. I think that's very important.
A lot of my colleagues, of course, in the U.S. media talk also about that, and I think it's maybe lack of information. A lot of people say still, we are still a dictatorship and all. We might not really our model may not be an exact copy of the American model or maybe the British model, the two main democracies in the world. But I think we are as an individual Pakistani citizen, I feel, we've moved along. I mean, we never had a media that was as vibrant as we have today, for example, and that's just one of the things. And women and so forth. I mean, sometimes even I, being a person who's, sometimes get very surprised at how fast we've moved forward in the past 5 or 6 years. And I feel that maybe my American colleagues need to better understand that thing. You being an American diplomat, being here in Islamabad, what's your sense?
Well, again, it's another strand in this discussion we've been having, the need to understand perceptions, realities, complexities. One of the reasons I've enjoyed myself so much being in Pakistan is because it's been such an education to me. Pakistan is very different from its neighbors to the west, where most of my experience is. And I always smile when people label this a military dictatorship. I mean, it's true the president is an army officer, but this is not a dictatorship. Democracy is important to us. But more importantly, it's also very important to Pakistanis. And that is why, for example, when President Bush was here and the joint statement by the two presidents was issued, there was a very clear reference to democratic development, in which President Bush committed the United States to support Pakistan as it continues to build strong and transparent democratic institutions and prepares for free and fair elections. That is the goal that President Musharraf has set for Pakistan. It is clearly the right goal because I think the long-term stability of our relationship is very much affected by it. And we've committed to try and support that, not by getting involved in domestic political issues, but by trying to help with things like computerizing voter rolls so that everyone will agree that it is an accurate, inclusive list of voters, providing other assistance to the Election Commission, because these things are important. But ultimately, and I think this is a key point that we all have to understand, democracies have to be developed by the country and the people involved. We have no model and no right to stand here and say this is what Pakistan needs. That's for the Pakistani people.
And so I think that's a very important point. You use the word build as we build, our democracy and all, and that's important because we're moving in that direction, and we're building the institutions, the things required to really have a successful democratic setup. And that's okay. One more point, Mr. Ambassador, is, and as we talk about the Pakistani-American relationship, trade. And I understand, of course, that we've moved forward in that. But one of the things that I understand the Pakistani officials have been working on with the American officials is a free trade agreement, and it seems to be very important because some of our products, could find a very good market in the United States, and Islamabad is very keen on that, because of course that'll also help us economically, and economy, and improving economy of course is one of the major strategies in fighting the war against terror, uplifting people and so forth. Any progress in that regard? Because there's a sense that the U.S. government is reluctant at the moment to move forward in that area, the free trade agreement. There's another agreement that I think Washington is more keen on for the time being. But Pakistanis are looking forward to the free trade agreement.
Well, first, let me say you touch on something that is important, which is our commercial, economic and financial relationships. It's just one of many categories that we're working on to build a much stronger overall relationship. And it's in good shape. The United States is Pakistan's largest customer. No other country in the world imports more from Pakistan than the United States does. And we continue to be your largest investor. We've got more money invested in Pakistan than any other single country. So it's a pretty robust relationship. And in terms of the trade balance, it's running about 3-to-1 in Pakistan's favor.
Really?
So things are going pretty well as they are. But we clearly have an interest in building them further. You mentioned the FTA. Where our focus has been on a bilateral investment treaty. We think it's important in its own right. As much investment as there is now from the U.S., if we are able to successfully conclude a treaty, that volume will rise considerably to the benefit of both of us. But it's important also for another reason. A bilateral investment treaty is effectively the investment chapter of an FTA. When we've done the investment treaty, we have finished a key chapter of the FTA, and then we can move on.
You mean it's a building block?
That's certainly how I see it. But if we can't do the investment treaty, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to take on a whole FTA, since you've got to have the investment agreement in any case. So I think it makes sense for both of us to focus our efforts on getting that done. Then you have the investment piece in place, and you can move on to look at the other areas of an FTA.
Right, that's a good point. Any hurdles, by the way, without getting into too many details, but any hurdles in securing the bilateral agreement first?
Well, we're clearly not there yet. I mean, there are a couple of issues that we've got to resolve. These are very complex considerations that it takes a room full of lawyers to try and interpret.
That's true. You mentioned Pakistan is way different than many of our neighbors to the west, the broader Middle East region, and that's where you, of course, have most of your experience. In fact, you're an Arabist. You speak Arabic very well, and you spent time in some of the key countries in the region, Syria, Kuwait, and other places, and you've been involved with the peace process with the Palestinians. Now, if I were, and you were in Kuwait as well, if I were to ask you, you spent 2.5 years here in Pakistan. We share many of the characteristics of our neighbors to the west, but some of the the major differences that you found in terms of how we are moving forward. Pakistan, how much Pakistan is really different. I mean, we like to think, many of the Pakistanis feel that, although we are a Muslim country, we are, and we share some of the problems that we see in the countries to our west, but we're also, moving fast forward, and we're trying to, change some of the things that you really found different here compared to your experience in the rest of the broader Middle East region.
Well, I just would make a couple of totally unscientific observations. One thing that any foreign visitor to Pakistan notices immediately is the very widespread use of the English language. It is one of the languages of Pakistan. It is taught in all the schools. It is the language of commerce, the language of intellectual circles. One instantly feels that one is in a familiar environment just because English is so wide spoken. And I think it's important because as you look to global economic competition, the language of commerce internationally is English, and you have a tremendous advantage over countries and businessmen who are not as well versed in the English language. Another element that strikes, I think, visitors coming to Pakistan is a very sophisticated, institutionalized framework of government and governance. The organization of the various sectors of government, executive and legislative, as well as judicial, are all very familiar to someone coming from the West. Over time, I think these institutions have become uniquely Pakistani, but their basic structure is quite familiar. And it makes it that much easier for Pakistan's friends, I think, to support the goals the government is trying to achieve. For example, in the legislative sector, although you're a parliamentary rather than a presidential system, it is still a system that's very familiar to us. So in response to Pakistani requests, we were able to fashion a legislative strengthening program to support the development of capabilities in both the provincial and the national level assemblies. So I just would start with those two observations, but there are many more.
Now, before we conclude, just very quickly, you'll be going to Baghdad, to Iraq. It's not the first time, of course, you were there immediately after the removal of Saddam Hussein. You were the number 2 person in the Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, after Ambassador Bremer. But still, I mean, the situation is so different. I mean, when we were first there, it was relatively calm. Not maybe quiet, but calm. But now it's one of the most dangerous places in the world today. And for an ambassador to agree to take a position there, that sounds, I would say it's very brave. As a journalist, if I were told to move to Baghdad right now, I might consider twice, although I spent 3 or 4 months there at that time, which was easy, really. So your decision to move up there, I'm sure personally that must be a difficult one, I mean, in terms of family.
Well, there is no greater challenge, I think, for us in the world right now than in Iraq. I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I do know something of the language, the culture, the political realities. So if I can bring some of that experience to bear in a positive way, I'm ready to step up to it. In terms of family, you mentioned my time in Iraq in 2003. I actually began my experience in Iraq a long time before that, in the late 70s when I was assigned there. And in 1979, I met the woman in Baghdad who is now my wife.
Really? We
were both assigned to the U.S. interest section of the Belgian embassy since we didn't have diplomatic relations. So inshallah, she will be going back to Baghdad with me this time as well. So as we've done throughout our careers, we'll take on this challenge together.
So both of you know Iraq very well, and Baghdad very well, for that matter.
We do.
Oh, that's great. Now, what would you do differently now, as compared to, of course, the first few months after the removal of Saddam Hussein? It's so much complicated, so much difficult now.
Well, it will be for the think tanks, the pundits, and the historians to look back and reinterpret history. I'm not going to have time for that. History for me will start when I get off the plane in Baghdad, and I'll be busy with working out how we move forward. I think the President has set out a very sound policy for this. It is clear at this juncture that the Iraqis must have the initiative. There is a government, there is an army, there is a police force. They've done a tremendous amount in 4 years to develop institutions and capabilities on their own. And they are determined, as they rightly should, that they will show the way forward. Our role is to support them. And that's exactly what we're doing in the current surge operation. The Iraqis are providing the main military force. The U.S. military is operating in support of Iraqi forces, but it's the Iraqis who are in front. Similarly, on the political and the economic side, the Iraqis have to set the agenda. They have to take the lead, and we have to support them. I think that's the main difference now as opposed to 4 years ago.
Of course, I'm going to just, before your parting words, I'm just going to ask you a test question. I mean, I'm not sure many Iraqis will be watching us. ولكن إذا كان العراقيون يشاهدوننا الآن، ما هي الرسالة التي من الممكن أن ترسلها لهم باللغة العربية؟
والله أنا سعيد جدا. أنا أرجع مرة ثانية إلى العراق، بلد كثير مهم في العالم وللولايات المتحدة، ورسالتي يعني كلمة واحدة: أنتم صامدين وأنا صامد.
Awesome, impressive. Now, as you spoke, of course, our viewers saw the subtitling in English of that, you know. Now, parting words, really, you'll be very soon, of course, moving to Baghdad. Any last words you'd like to say?
My time in Pakistan, 2.5 years, is all too short. I would have liked very much to prolong my stay here. It's a country that is critically important to U.S. interests. But even more than that, personally, I've just thoroughly enjoyed my time here. It's a great nation. The Pakistanis are tremendously hospitable people, from the very top down to street level. And that's what I'll carry away with me, that for all of our differences, sometimes in policy and perception, neither I nor members of my staff have ever encountered any street-level anti-Americanism, and I think that speaks a great deal about the innate hospitality and generosity of Pakistanis.
That's very kind of you. Of course, one of the things about you, the lasting impressions I have of you, is that you're, I think, a well-formed man with your interest in diplomacy and history and so many things. You also have a deep interest in music, and I was glad I saw you in the Middle East, and you had interest in music there. And in Pakistan, I'm surprised that you also took interest in the Pakistani music scene, the Pakistani pop music, and you, in fact, were gracious enough to encourage that music by introducing the Americans to that music, holding a couple of events here that combined American audience with Pakistani rock or pop bands. I thought that was really amazing, and I think you have really good taste in music, because you listen to John Bon Jovi, one of my favorite singers. I hope you enjoyed the Pakistani rock scene here as well.
Well, it's you're absolutely right. I mean, my inclination in music tends toward the heavier side of the rock spectrum. But in the opportunities I had here with some of the Pakistani groups, I wasn't really doing anything new. I was building on something that had been done before. And you probably recall some years back, the great Pakistani musician Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan developed an association with some major American rock groups. Pearl Jam was the most prominent, part of the grunge rock movement of the West Coast. And they put together a fusion of American grunge rock and classical Pakistani music that was just marvelous. And I was very pleased to find when I got to Pakistan that fusion is alive and well. And more importantly than that, if you put Pakistani musicians and American musicians together, they'll rediscover it all by themselves, and I look forward to hearing a lot more of that.
We need to do that, really, to build those bridges. Ambassador Ryan C. Crocker, thank you very much. I thank you very much for being kind enough to join us here in the studio, and I wish you the best of luck in your future.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Ambassador. That was the interview with the Ambassador of the United States of America, who graciously gave us quite a bit of his time, really, to share with us some interesting observations and insights about his period here in Pakistan. Thank you again, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you.